All right, perfect. So I will, hello all watching the recording later. I will, as usual, post the recording just so anyone who wants to review has it, especially if there's any questions that come up that are relevant to everyone's projects. I want to have that resource there. So, all right. So welcome, everyone. Again, thank you all for being here the last night of our class. It's been I was going to say, I know there's been a lot of questions that I've gotten this week about, drafts and hypotheses that you all are going through. So, so far everyone that sent me things have, really looked good. Please feel free, anyone watching, anyone listening now, please feel free to send me anything that you want. I'll send an email probably tomorrow, just as kind of a reminder on the final project report and that it is due this weekend. But just as a reminder, you will have that grace period that is available to you. If you wanted just an extra couple days, you will have till that following Tuesday. But again, I'll send an email tomorrow just clarifying that. So before we jump in, I will definitely have time to go over kind of questions regarding the final project report, but any questions in general about anything else besides that? And I want to make sure to have time to cover any of your questions that you have. About anything else? Anything in particular? About last week's material? Again, overall, these scores for all of your assignment number 7s were fantastic. So, hopefully everyone's feeling pretty confident about, SPSS and that portion of it. Just as a reminder, and I'll say this again, for your final project report, remember you won't be actually using a data set. You'll be entering kind of variables like you would for that code book, but there's nothing that you're actually analyzing in SPSS. So, just if you're looking for that, feel free to email me, obviously, to clarify, but just, keep that in mind. So, you've already showed me you can do analysis in SPSS. I want kind of the, I would say, more broad picture for the final project report. So any additional questions on anything else before we jump in? All right, I figure we'll start off, just because we didn't have a ton of time to go over it in depth. I want to start off just going over that uses for various statistical tests document. Just in a little bit more detail. We won't necessarily go kind of test by test, but I want to make sure, everyone's feeling confident on, what we've, anything that's confusing on this, and also, have time to ask questions on different tests that are included, keeping in mind that, remember, these aren't the only tests that you'll see in statistics. There's a ton of different tests out there. Many of them are listed under that What Stat to Choose website that I pulled up last time, which I think is just, not necessarily for the final project paper. You can use it for that as well, but, really a resource after the class. I just think it's a great resource to have for looking at, what call to make on different tests, but also, more than that, the coding and how it looks in different statistical softwares. We've obviously been focusing on SPSS in this class, but, there's a lot of different programs out there. SAS is very commonly used, Stata is commonly used, and, I would say those are 3 of the biggest ones in public health. I would say R is also a program out there that's getting more wide attention. There are, I would say in some ways the user interface is not as great, but the great thing about R is it's free. So, if anyone's interested in those programs, please let me know. So there is a question. Let me just answer the question. And again, I'll read the questions out loud. So we haven't actually run analysis on one of those tests, but it fits our data. Can we choose it if we justify the choice? Absolutely. So, for something like logistic regression, we didn't talk about logistic regression in SPSS, specifically because in SPSS, and honestly the test in general, it's one of our more complex and in a lot of ways useful, but one of our more complex tests because of the different, the good thing is we can include multiple variables as predictor variables. So totally can use logistic regression as, and many of you might have that be one of the options for your analysis, let's say, on one of your hypotheses, but absolutely okay that you don't feel necessarily super confident doing it in SPSS. If you're wondering how, I'm happy to send you some resources that way, but it will likely be a test choice that comes up that I encourage you to consider depending on how your hypotheses are structured. So hopefully I answered your question on that one. So, but you would use logistic regression if you have one or more independent variables that are either interval variables or categorical variables, either one. But the key thing is if you have a dichotomous dependent variable and you have multiple independent variables, then you're going with logistic regression. If you have a dichotomous dependent variable and you have an interval, if you have one interval independent variable, then you would go logistic regression as well. So absolutely would be a good choice. Question, I'm interested in SAS. How can I formally take the stateside class at CSUN? We actually don't have a SAS stateside course at CSUN. Great question. In the public health program, I'm not sure if they offer SAS in any other programs on campus. But let me look into that a little bit more and find out a little bit more information about that specific one. It's not in the public health program. I think it's 48. Again, 48, if it's the health science 48, that's just epidemiology for undergrads. So let me look into if we have a SAS class at CSUN that's offered. It's not one that I've heard of students taking before, but I'll definitely find out. So I will let you know. Question, what did dichotomous mean? Great question. What did dichotomous mean? Dichotomous is when it has two options, right? So when it has yes, no, true, false, it's a binary kind of response. So 1, 0, had disease, didn't have disease. So that's what dichotomous means. So when we have kind of two responses there, yes and no. So if we have, for example, a lot of those outcome variables that you might be choosing, let's say heart disease or diabetes, how it is worded in the questionnaire. And again, we talked about a lot in class, variables can be worded in different ways depending on the variable, right? I can ask, do you have heart disease? Yes or no. I can ask, when were you diagnosed with heart disease? Totally different question structure. So, again, as worded on the questionnaire, there's a lot of those yes or no options. Those are all dichotomous variables. So those would be appropriate for logistic regression, and we can kind of start at the bottom since we're already, really talking about logistic regression. Those are appropriate if you have a dichotomous dependent variable. But if you have an independent variable that's also dichotomous or categorical, and you're only looking at one dichotomous dependent variable, you can do logistic regression, but I would say a chi-square test might be more appropriate in that case, just because there's a little less complexity to the test. You're having to, if you have a categorical independent variable, you can do it in logistic regression, but there's a little bit more background that you would need to do. And so while you can do it, I would say a chi-square test would be usually the more appropriate choice. So if we have something like, I'm trying to think of other variables in the data set. If we have something like gender in, as written, I think there was male, female, other, prefer not to state as one of our variables, and we're looking for the relationship between gender and heart disease. Heart disease would be that dichotomous variable, yes or no. Gender would be a categorical variable, right? A nominal variable in that case as worded. So logistic regression could be used, but I would say a chi-square test, a two-variable chi-square test in that case would be more appropriate. So another question, regarding correlation. Why, if the dependent variable is ordinal and the independent variable categorical, can we not run a correlation or regression? Neither are dichotomous. So let me just make sure I'm understanding the question. Why, if the dependent variable is ordinal and the independent variable categorical, can we not run a correlation or regression? So neither are dichotomous. That's true. So two types of regression, linear regression and logistic regression that we've talked about. There are other types. No, absolutely, yeah. Always feel free to take over the mic. Amber?
Yeah, Dr. Marsh, sorry.
No.
I was typing really quickly. So I was just wondering if I'm trying to find like an association between two variables and my dependent variable is ordinal and my independent variable is categorical.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time because I feel like I'd want to run a correlation, but I couldn't because neither are dichotomous.
So you would, with a correlation, usually you're running correlation if you actually have, not necessarily dichotomous, but if you have two quantitative variables. So in that case, if you have something like height and weight, if you have age and blood pressure, that would be where correlation is most, I would say, useful. To look at an association between. So you're essentially saying, as age goes up, what happens to blood pressure, right? So in that case, you would run a correlation. If you have an ordinal, you said dependent variable and a kind of categorical or nominal independent variable, that would be a situation where you would run a two-variable chi-squared test. You're looking for an association between variables that essentially, even though it's ordinal, it's likely ordinal categorical. You're essentially looking for the association between two categorical variables there.
Okay.
Does that make more sense?
It does. Yeah. Sorry. When I use the language of like an association or a correlation, I automatically assume, oh, it's a correlation, but.
Exactly. And so that's super common because, that's how we use the phrase, that's how we use the term correlation in just general practice. And that's why, with your hypotheses, just be careful. Association is appropriate, relationship is appropriate, but correlation usually implies something specific in that kind of calculating of that correlation coefficient. So I would say just be careful unless you are doing that with and there is a way of doing them with non-quantitative variables, but again, usefulness, I would say it would be better to use another test in that case, because correlation is most useful when you're really looking at kind of the strength of an association between those two quantitative variables.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll kind of leave off at logistic regression. Again, we're just going to kind of not jump around necessarily, but I just want to make sure, well, actually, let me start off just saying a couple important points about things to think about when you're thinking about what test to choose, because again, that's what I think is one of the hardest parts of the project. And so when you're looking at when to choose what test, I would say really think about essentially two different things. The first thing that I think is not most important, but I would say the first step to think about, even before you think about what type of variables you're looking at, is really think about what is your independent variable and what is your dependent variable. Because a lot of the tests that we're talking about, you need to know, again, even before talking about what measurement scale each variable is on, you need to know what variable you're looking at as your outcome variable or your dependent variable. So in, just a quick review, when you're looking at your dependent variable, that is essentially the one that you're looking at is being affected by your independent variable. Different tests, we call them slightly different things. We might call it and different textbooks, honestly, call them slightly different things. Some might call them an outcome variable. Some might call them your Y variable, depending on the model, depending on the analysis you're doing. Some might call them your dependent variable, but essentially that's the variable that we're looking for, what has an effect on that variable. So if you're looking at something like age and heart disease, you're going to, again, not to go back to heart disease again, but heart disease is really our dependent variable there, right? We're looking at the effect age has on heart disease. So heart disease would be our dependent variable. So that's really, I would say, one of the first steps. Figure out what you want as your dependent variable. And I say that, there are some obvious relationships like age and heart disease, age being your independent, affecting potentially your dependent of heart disease. But there are some associations that aren't necessarily super obvious and are more up to you. So for example, if we looked at let's say diet and heart disease. Again, seems obvious, right? Well, you're looking at the impact on a person's diet has on their risk of heart disease. So heart disease would stay your dependent variable with diet being your independent. But what if our research question of interest was how does diet change after someone has been diagnosed with heart disease? It's a valid question that we can ask, right? In that case, we're looking at heart disease status, whether or not they have been diagnosed with heart disease, and the effect that it might have on a person's diet. So, again, that would be a situation where we could change it. We could kind of look out of the traditional sense of how we're thinking of heart disease as an outcome, and change it to actually be, in that case, our independent variable. So that's why it's going to be really important. How have you worded your hypothesis? And that's one of the things I'm going to be looking for. And one of the things that I really focused on your first assignment, when you're thinking about your variables, it's important of that wording of your hypotheses, because that will change what analysis you might do if you're using a test specifically for, where your independent variable has to be this and your dependent variable has to be that. So I would say, again, first step, really think about what your independent variable is and what your dependent variable is. And if you're, have any questions, I tried to, in a lot of the examples, so just looking at the examples, given someone's age, what do we predict their cholesterol level would be? And that would be a case where cholesterol level we're looking at as the dependent variable. We're looking to see how age affects the dependent variable, right? How age affects cholesterol level. Is there an association between weight and systolic blood pressure? As worded, might not be as clear, but you can, maybe assume that we're looking at how weight affects systolic blood pressure. So you're treating weight as your independent, systolic blood pressure as your dependent or outcome variable. If we're looking at something like, is there an association between race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status classification? That would be a situation where it's a little bit murkier, right? Are we looking at, I would say as worded in that question, it looks like race, ethnicity is kind of our independent, socioeconomic is our dependent, right? When we're having just an association between variables like that, it can be a little bit harder to tell, all right, which one am I treating as what? So for something like a two-variable chi-square test, it doesn't matter as much. But if we were to jump down to something where a logistic regression would be appropriate, then we would really have to tell what we're treating as the dependent, what we're treating as the independent. So I'd say more than anything else, start there. What is your independent? What is your dependent? After you've done that, then you can start to think about, I would say the next step is really starting to think about with all these different tests, you'll notice really one of the biggest things is, well, how are these variables measured, right? First, kind of even beyond that, how many variables do we have, right? If we only have one variable, then maybe we're doing a one sample t-test or a one variable chi-square test. So for example, is there a difference between the mean GPA of CSUN undergraduate students and the national mean GPA of all US undergrad students? The only variable that we have there is GPA, right? And then we have different populations. We have CSUN undergrads versus the national, but the only variable that we have there is GPA. So that's where one sample t-test would be appropriate. Similar, a one variable chi-square test is the population, an example, is the population of the US evenly distributed among socioeconomic status classifications? The only variable that we're looking at there is socioeconomic status, right? So socioeconomic status is our one variable of interest, and then we have a population that we're just looking to see, is SES distributed evenly? Another situation where a test that focuses on one variable is what you're looking at. In that case, you don't have to say independent versus dependent. So, but if you have two or more variables, then it's important to really think independent versus dependent. So maybe that should be the first step. How many variables are you looking at in your question? And then if you're looking at more than one, what is your independent, what is your dependent? And then again, the question after to ask is really, how are those variables measured? How is your independent variable measured? How is your dependent variable measured? And by measured, first look at how the question was worded, because remember, all of your variables These are not open-ended variables like it was on assignment number 1, where I was kind of having you more model what you would do on your kind of developing your own questionnaire. This is really meant to be, you have an existing data set, you have these defined variables, what are you doing with them? And so that's really, where you want to think about how questions were worded specifically. Question. So yeah, and we'll go into the different measurements now. But question was categorical, something like very satisfied, satisfied, or not satisfied? Absolutely. So categorical, that would be, so categorical is this kind of general phrase when we're looking at anything with categories. So a categorical variable can be nominal, where we have something like gender, race, ethnicity. There's no real ordering to any of the categories. We can also have an ordinal categorical variable. So an ordinal categorical variable is something like very satisfied, satisfied, not satisfied. There's categories there, there's response categories, but it's ordinal, meaning that there is some order to those response categories. So absolutely, very satisfied, satisfied, not satisfied would be categorical, but specifically it would be ordinal categorical. So another question, again, hopefully let me know if I don't answer your question and I'll kind of just move down. I have a question like questions 15 and 16 is open-ended, are the same as 11 and 12. So first, what do you mean by what questions, 15 and 16? From the questionnaire. I'm assuming you mean from the questionnaire. So let me go ahead and pull up that, sorry. Let me go ahead and pull up the questionnaire. And again, I'll pop that up on the screen in just a second. So, pulling it up, questionnaire. And while that's pulling up, just follow, do you say ordinal categorical, not just categorical, or just ordinal? I would say it depends on, some people will just refer to it as categorical. Some people will want that clarification that it is ordinal categorical. I would say it's best to say ordinal categorical just to be very clear. So, I wouldn't say if you just said ordinal, that's fine. If you just said categorical in your justification, that's also fine. But I would say it's helpful. Like for something like, I would say it's more helpful to be more specific, especially because categorical could be nominal or it could be ordinal. All right, so let me, numerical, hold on, I'm sharing the questionnaire now. You should all be able to see the questionnaire, just going over. So I have a question like 15 and 16 for open-ended. So great question. 15 and 16 and 12 and 13 on this questionnaire are open-ended. So what is the average number of servings of fruit you consume? What is the average number of alcoholic drinks? What is the average number of hours per sleep? Average number of hours per week you spend watching TV? All of those would be considered there's no categories, right? So it definitely wouldn't be categorical. It's not nominal, right? There's absolutely, people are going to enter a number there, right? So people are going to enter an average number of something. That number, whatever they're entering for all 4 of those questions, is going to have an inherent order. Obviously, if someone enters, they consume 2 servings of fruit versus 5 servings, you know which is more, right? You know what that number means. That's not just a made-up number that you've coded as, one of the type of housing categories. 1 is 1, 1 is 5, right? That is a number that means something. So in that case, those would be numerical, but specifically those would be interval ratio or scale variables. Those would be interval ratio or scale because they have a meaningful order to those numbers. And there is the ability to do more mathematical calculations on those numbers versus if we had response categories of, let me give you an example. If we had, when was your last physical exam at a doctor's office? This is also some case where, we have months. Months are, in concept, in theory, a scale variable, but how we've worded it on this questionnaire, within 1 month, 1 to 2 months, 3 to 5, 6 to 12, more than 12, this wouldn't be scale, this would be ordinal. Because we have these response categories where there is a clear order, but the interval between categories isn't necessarily the same. And so we can't, add up B and C and get D. We can't add up D and E and get anything meaningful. So there are mathematical operations that we can't necessarily do with these different categories, but there's still an inherent order there. So in that case, again, kind of going back to the original question, 12, 13, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16, all of those would be scale variables, interval ratio variables. Whereas I should have just looked instead of scrolling down. Number 14, on the other hand, how it's worded. So 0, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 plus. This is something that came up in your own questions when you're developing that I commented on. In this case, this wouldn't be scale. This would be entered in as an ordinal variable because there is inherent order to those categories, but there's not kind of the same distance between those categories as each other. Okay, so kind of going back, let me stop sharing. I'm going to share, jump back to the document. So again, think about how things are measured. And again, this is a process you're welcome to ask me. You're welcome to email me. I've had a lot of emails this week that I've tried to answer all of them. Was an example of scale. Scale variables are those variables that we just talked about. What is your age? What is the average number of servings of fruits you consume? So scale in this case, scale is what SPSS calls it. Scale is the same in this case as interval ratio. We're treating as the same anyway. So you can either, in your justification, you can either say, we have an interval ratio. No, not the same, not necessarily open-ended questions, because remember, open-ended questions can be qualitative as well. I can ask you, how do you feel? Right? And you're like, oh, I feel good, right? I feel fine. I feel whatever. So scale or interval ratio is specifically numerics. So it has to have numbers, and numbers that have meaningful values, like an average number of alcoholic drinks you consume. So, but there is we haven't limited the categories and kind of grouped the categories in inconsistent ways. So in that case, the interval ratio variables on this questionnaire, the ones we just talked about, were open-ended, but kind of quantitative open-ended, which is what made them interval ratio. So kind of jumping back, again, let me make sure I've jumped back correctly because I couldn't see it on my screen. All right, so I feel like this is blocking it. Give me 1 second, unblock it. All right, so again, asking yourself what type of variables that you're working with, what level of variables you're working with, what's the independent, what's the dependent, I think is probably the most important things as you're going through this when you're justifying. And that's what I'm going to want to see in your justification. I'm going to want to see, why that you've chosen that test. And, and again, you can go through the example that I posted on the example final project report to, see an option for some wording. So with wording of things, so, and I know there's another question. Again, I want to kind of move away a little bit just so we have time to answer all the questions, or kind of go through everything, but I'll answer this one last question on this point. So for a question like how many drinks do you have, letting the person state the number would be scale. And if you gave the options of 0, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, this would be ordinal. Yes, generally, because you are creating categories where there's not even divides between the categories. So again, it will depend on how the question is worded. Pay attention to how the question is worded on the questionnaire in this case. All right, so again, think about the measurements, think how it's measured, think about interval independent versus dependent. And when you're justifying, make sure to include all of that information, right? So if you're justifying, let's say we have this question. Is there a difference in the mean systolic blood pressure of people of high, medium, and low socioeconomic status? Remember, all of these are worded. If they have a question mark, if it's worded this way, this isn't a hypothesis. This is more a research question. We could turn this into a hypothesis by saying there's a difference in the mean systolic blood pressure of people of high, medium, and low socioeconomic status, right? Hypotheses are all statements. And in this case, you would know you can justify. I would use a one-factor or one-way ANOVA for this because I have a, and think about what the independent variable is. So is there a difference in the mean systolic blood pressure of people of high, medium, and low socioeconomic status? So socioeconomic, you're looking for the impact socioeconomic status has on blood pressure. So in that case, socioeconomic status would be your independent variable, blood pressure would be your dependent. Okay, so starting there. What kind of measurement is each? So, and I would say starting off with what the dependent is sometimes can be more helpful. So the dependent variable is mean systolic blood pressure. That is a scale interval ratio variable, right? So a scale or interval ratio variable, again, either one of those words would be fine. Again, most often you won't hear scale, most often you'll hear interval ratio. Scale is just what SPSS calls it. So you could justify in saying, we have a scale or interval ratio dependent variable, and we have an independent variable, right? Your independent variable is socioeconomic status. You have an independent variable that is either nominal or ordinal. In this case, socioeconomic status is ordinal. And, and why am I saying and? That would be part of the justification. But remember, one factor ANOVA is pretty similar to a two independent samples t-test in the situations. So, you must have a nominal or ordinal independent variable and an interval ratio dependent variable. You must have a nominal, ordinal, or independent variable and an interval ratio dependent variable. Those are the same words. The big difference, the big choice between a one factor ANOVA and a two independent sample t-test is this key phrase. I'm not sure if you can see my highlighting on the screen, so I'm just going to circle, is this key phrase here with only two independent groups. And if you see, we scroll down to our ANOVA, we have specifically with more than two groups. So that is something I would want to see in your justification. We have more than two groups of our independent variable of socioeconomic status. We have high, medium, and low. So that is why we cannot do a two independent sample t-test, because we have more than two groups that we're comparing. If we had two groups, if we were just looking at high versus low SES status, and that's how our variable was defined, well, then we could do a two independent sample t-test, and that's what we would say. We would say a two independent sample t-test is appropriate because we have a nominal or ordinal independent variable with two groups and two groups alone, and an interval ratio dependent variable. So I would say that's kind of the last thing that I would want to see, if relevant, in your justification. How many groups or how many categories of that independent or dependent variable that you have? And most often it's the independent, well, I would say with dichotomous, it's also, worth mentioning there if you're a dependent variable, but it's going to be relevant when differentiating between a one factor ANOVA and a two independent sample t-test. How many categories of that independent variable you have. So again, in each of these, and I wanted to highlight this document, again, you can, I'm sure, many of you have browsed through this already, but I just wanted to remind you of key things to really start with, because I've had, a lot of questions on, well, where do I start with this hypothesis, right? Again, I would say start with first, how many variables do you have? Then think about which is your independent, which is your dependent. Then think about how those are measured. And then kind of lastly, if relevant, think about how many response categories you have for each. How many groups are you comparing for each? So in one last thing I want to mention before kind of I really open it up for questions on whatever you want to go over, in terms of if you have specific parts of the questionnaire or the final project paper that you want to discuss, we can kind of go from there. But I do want to mention something I've been seeing a lot in the drafts that are sent to me or the questions that are sent to me. So in a questionnaire, and let me actually pull up the questionnaire just to make this super clear. stop sharing. I'm going to start sharing again. Give me 1 second. Share screen. Okay. So you should all see the questionnaire. So if you have, and this happens, and I mentioned this because I want this to model what you see in practice, and in a data set, there is absolute flexibility in some things. So if you have, what is your age in years, right? Kind of our standard first variable, what is your age in years? In that case, it is worded as an interval ratio variable. Great. What you can do if you have a variable like this, if it is worded like this in a questionnaire, you can absolutely leave it as is and say something like, people of different ages have a different risk of heart disease. Age has an impact on the risk of heart disease. You would do analysis treating age as the variable, how it is written. They write a number. You kind of put that into whatever analysis model that you're using. Something else you can do, and something that is absolutely okay, but will affect your analysis, is, let me just kind of write here, this is an example. So if you said something like people who are, and several people had kind of a similar-ish thing to this, people who are over the age of 30 have a higher likelihood of heart disease than people under the age of 30. So just an example. People who are over the age of 30 have a higher likelihood of heart disease than people under the age of 30. What you've essentially done with that variable of age. So it was, what is your age in years? Again, you can look at the association. What is the impact? What is the association of age on heart disease? How this hypothesis is worded, though, is you've essentially dichotomized the variable of age. You now have two categories of age that you have made based on the wording of your hypothesis. One is people over 30, and you are comparing that to people compared to people under 30. You have essentially changed the variable of age, which was interval ratio. You have changed it to essentially a nominal variable, people over 30, people under 30. Another way I could write this question now is, are you under 30? Yes, no. Right? Based on the wording of that, that's essentially this question. That's okay to do. That's fine. And you can do that with, a ton of different, you couldn't kind of go the opposite way. Obviously, if there are age categories, you couldn't then treat age as an interval ratio variable because there are age categories included. But if you've chosen to do this, that's going to change the analysis because, and this is why, I mention it now, I mentioned, think about how things are measured, what scale of measurement that's being used. In this case, you've changed the scale of measurement of that original variable. So now age is no longer, based on the wording, age is no longer interval ratio. Age in this case is kind of a dichotomous yes or no, right? Age is a nominal variable in that case. So for this particular hypothesis, you have age that you have, turned into this yes-no variable, and you have heart disease, which you have turned in, which was inherently a yes-no variable based on the questionnaire. So you now have an independent variable of age that is nominal, and you have a dependent variable of heart disease, which is nominal, yes or no. And so in that case, your most appropriate type of test that you would do would be a two-variable chi-squared test, because you just have two variables that are kind of categorical, in this case, that are nominal. So I mentioned that because that's something I was seeing a lot of in people's drafts. So they were kind of taking a variable and, and again, it's not bad to do this. It's just something to keep in mind for your analysis. You are taking a variable and then treating it how you want to treat it. And that's fine. But just be careful of what that means for your analysis. So, and I'll give you another example. So what is your gender? Male, female, other, prefer not to state. In this case, that variable of gender has 4 different categories, right? Male, female, other, prefer not to state. You can, from that variable, you can look at males have a higher systolic blood pressure, and systolic blood pressure I think was a variable, have a higher systolic blood pressure than females. That is a hypothesis you can create if gender was one of your variables and systolic blood pressure was another. And I mentioned this one because you're kind of keeping the variable as is. You're keeping males and females. You're not changing it that, it's a nominal variable. You're keeping it nominal. But males have a higher systolic blood pressure than females in your hypothesis. So in this case, you are changing, there was 4 response categories. Essentially, you're changing this to just compare 2. You're changing it to compare males and females. If there was 4 response, so, and again, let's kind of do just a little review. In this case, your independent variable, or not review, but your independent variable, if I can spell it correctly, would it be gender or would it be systolic blood pressure? So you tell me, would your independent variable be gender or would it be systolic blood pressure? Anyone? Any ideas? What are we looking for? I want to make sure everyone's feeling confident with that independent versus dependent. In this case, we're looking at if one variable has an effect on another variable. In this case, gender is our independent. Our dependent is systolic blood pressure. We're looking at if gender has an impact on systolic blood pressure. So we would have to say, all right, we now know our independent versus dependent. Gender is nominal, right? Systolic blood pressure is interval ratio. So we would go through, we would find the tests appropriate for a nominal independent variable and a interval ratio dependent variable. But in this case, there's one more step, right? That kind of 4th question, if relevant, that you have to ask. How many categories do we have of our independent variable? As worded in your hypothesis, in this hypothesis, we're just comparing 2, males to females. So in this case, it would be a 2 independent sample t-test that would be appropriate. As worded in the original question, we have 4 different categories, right? Other, prefer not to state are also categories. We've just, for this hypothesis, we've chosen to just really compare those 2. If we had 4, if we had treated it as is, well, then a 1-factor ANOVA would be more appropriate. So again, I mention this because this is what I've seen so far in everyone who submitted drafts to me. I think almost everyone has kind of changed a variable just a little bit based on a comparison that they might have been interested in, and that's fine to do, but just keep in mind that that might have an impact on your analysis. And that's what I've kind of continued to say on feedback. Fine, because again, that's what, I want you to really think about what you would do in practice. That's fine to do in practice as well. Fine to do here, but just think about any impact that might have. So question, can we use the questionnaire answer options verbatim? Of course. So you can use them exactly as is. I mentioned that because that's something that I've seen in the drafts being submitted. People are tweaking things a little bit, based on, again, either intentionally or unintentionally. So, and that's fine, but you can also use them exactly as is. So, you absolutely don't have to tweak them. If you want to use them as they are stated, totally fine to do. So either way. Interval ratio was, again, when you have interval ratio, we were treating a scale. So we were kind of using those terms synonymously. Interval ratio is when you have something like number of drinks per week, number of hours spent exercising. So that was interval ratio. So, okay. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. Those were the big points that I wanted to try to hit home for the final project report, because those were one common questions I would say coming up from the several drafts that I was seeing submitted, but also just general things I wanted you to keep in mind after the class as well, because I want this to not only be relevant for something that you're doing, that's due in a couple days, but I want you to, these are some of the most common things that I've seen, when doing a research project. When you're doing analysis, you really want to think about, all right, what am I going to do with these data? What am I going to do with this data? What am I going to do with these variables? Whether you're collecting your own data or using a secondary data set, all of these questions are going to be questions you ask yourself over and over again. So I want everyone, that's one of the focuses of this project. I want everyone to feel really hopefully confident kind of doing this in practice as well. So we'll kind of open it up for just general questions that you might have on the final project report. Less about, I would say, maybe more specific to your project, and maybe just kind of general for now, because again, any questions that you have specific to your project, I would say would be probably easier to answer in an email, in a Zoom. I've set up several Zoom sessions with many of you this week to kind of talk through things. I've, had a lot of email conversations this week with you. Again, whatever format that you want to get your questions answered, I'm happy to answer them that way. So just let me know. But I would say just general, any points of confusion that you might not be as comfortable with, kind of the direction to go, any issues that you wanted to discuss now, this would be a great time to bring them up. Let me I'm going to pull up the Canvas site just so we can kind of pull up the prompt for the final project report. Of course, I go away from it. So as you're thinking or maybe chatting, and again, feel free, if it's easier, always feel free to talk on the mic. If it's easier to kind of construct your questions that way, that's fine. Just keep in mind, your final project report description, what I'm looking for is going to be here. The questionnaire is where you're going to be pulling your variables from. So the example final project report is just if you want kind of that reference of what things, it's a kind of a scaled down version of what you're going to be submitting. So including the code book, don't forget the descriptive statistics, please. I know we're focusing a lot on the statistical analysis, but the descriptive statistics are a part of it. So I want you to kind of go over what would be appropriate. And then kind of looking at the chosen test and justification based on your hypotheses. And the last thing is that limitations section. And your limitation should be based on how the questions were worded, potentially. So kind of going back to the questionnaire. How was the study conducted? So, it was only conducted in California, Arizona, and Oregon. Is that a limitation at all? Will that affect how you might apply this on a national scale? It was done by phone interview. What are some issues with phone interviews? Right? What are some limitations there? It was done, it was a 5 to 25-minute interview. What are some issues that come up in the data collection process, kind of relevant to things that we've talked about, and kind of way back on assignment, 2, 3? So we talked about kind of data distribution methods. So that's kind of where I wanted you to pull some ideas for limitations, as well as how were some questions worded, right? So the question on education level, which of the following describes your level of education? If you're using this as a variable, well, there are some good categories, right? But it doesn't really go into depth on what college degree people got. It doesn't really go into depth on what people are going to graduate school for. That might be of interest, right? That's, again, a limitation that, it's not necessarily a problem with this question, but something that limitations can just be something that's lacking. It doesn't have to be, what did this thing do wrong? It can be, but it can be, okay, what other information might have wanted to have about education level that maybe the questionnaire is missing, if this is one of your variables. So that's what I'm looking for when I talk limitations. Super flexible. Again, you don't have to go into all the limitations, but again, I would say maybe a few sentences on overall limitations that you think might affect your particular project, your particular analysis. So questions. And I'm going to want to wait for questions that you have. We're supposed to have a descriptive statistic for all variables? Yes. So I want you to have descriptive statistics for all the variables that you've, should clarify, that you've chosen. So in this case, for this example, we chose 4 different variables. Again, these are not 4 variables that are necessarily included. This is just an example. So we've included the variable of arthritis, sedentary job, BMI, active lifestyle. And so your descriptive statistics, just like your code book, should include every single variable that you have chosen for your analysis. Again, not every variable on the questionnaire, just ones you have chosen. Your descriptive statistics should include each of those variables that you have chosen. So in this case, we've chosen 4 variables. Your descriptive statistics should be on the 4 variables. Arthritis, as worded, as analyzed, is nominal. Right? Arthritis is measured has arthritis, does not have arthritis. It is specifically dichotomous and nominal. Not all nominal variables are dichotomous, have 2 categories. But you would want to say that it's nominal. And again, what I'm looking for in the descriptive statistics is just what measure of central tendency that you would want to have with that variable. In this case, we would only be able to do the mode because we're working with a nominal variable. And that's kind of going back to, I would encourage you to go back to your descriptive statistics slides in that lecture that we talked about, what measures of central tendency are appropriate with what types of variables. Mode is the only one appropriate with nominal variables. We have an interval ratio variable like BMI. We can use the mean, median, and mode. Again, there's nothing you're calculating here, right? Because there's no actual data that you have. But we would use the mean, median, and mode with BMI because we could. That's what I'm looking for in the descriptive statistics section. So you're just going to list the variables that you're using. I think it'd be helpful to list the type of variable that you're working with, but I'm going to be looking for you to list what measure of central tendency, and kind of going back to the prompt exactly as that's worded. Why isn't it scrolling? There we go. So the descriptive statistics for each variable, any measures of central tendency that can be calculated should be noted. So all you're doing is you're saying, we can calculate the mean and median. We can calculate the mean, median, and mode with this variable. Again, because you don't actually have data, you're not actually doing any descriptive analysis, but I do want to kind of bring that point up and keep, kind of refreshing that on what descriptive statistics you might be able to do with that variable. Other questions? As far as the due date, is there a grace period for Tuesday? I did mention, yes, there is a grace period till Tuesday. So I will mention that again in a note, but you still have the grace period if you'd like to take it. Remember, that does cut into your spring break, so just keep that in mind for yourselves. But, the deadline will stay as it has for all the assignments. The deadline will stay on Sunday, but you can submit it via that until Tuesday with no late penalty. However, that really is the deadline for Tuesday without any late penalty. So, I encourage you, that is not the, oh no, you're still having technical issues on Tuesday at 4 p.m. exactly. Tuesday at 4 p.m. is, don't wait until then to try to submit and then realize you're having technical issues. So, that is the deadline. And, again, if you do, I'll still accept it, but it will be considered late after that point. So make sure you're feeling comfortable. Again, don't wait till Tuesday at 3 p.m. to ask me questions, because you won't, I will likely not see your email in time. And I would say, if you have questions, again, I'm happy to answer them via email. I'm happy to set up Zoom sessions with you. but I don't know that I'll be as available via Zoom on like Monday or Tuesday. I'll try to answer emails next week, but please, please don't wait. I don't want you to wait till the last minute to get your questions answered and then not have your questions answered. So again, I'll be checking email all weekend. I'm happy to set up Zooms sessions with you to go over questions. I want you to feel confident. This is, not only the last step in the class, but really the culmination of a lot of what we've been talking about. This is things I want you to feel confident leaving the class with. I want you to feel confident knowing that you could pick up a data set, feel confident with different types of analysis to do on the variables that you might be interested in. So any questions at all about anything? Related to, again, final project report, anything else, just in general? Okay, so we can end there for the evening, just because, I think I hit all the things that I wanted to emphasize. Oh, yes, the session is recorded, so absolutely recorded, just as usual. It will be posted as soon as it renders later tonight. I will post this right under the week 8 recording, so absolutely. Question, do we need a cover page? No, you don't need a cover page. And great question, just in general, formatting-wise, no specific format. I would say just organization. Make sure it's organized, kind of logically flows. No real clear, nothing I'm expecting in terms of cover sheet, nothing I'm expecting in terms of specific order. So again, we'll end there for the evening. Again, I'm happy to stick around for a couple extra minutes, but I will say at the very end, thank you all. I know this is going to be our last time to meet live as a group, so I really appreciate you all. Just in general, thank you all for being part of the class. Thank you for everything this semester. Hopefully you got something out of this. I'm happy to be a resource for you after the class ends. Don't think this is the last time that we will talk. But, please let me know anything that I can help with. Obviously, until Sunday, but let me know anything I can help with afterwards as well. I'd love talking with all of you. I've loved getting to know all of you. But, again, don't consider this the last time that, you have to talk with me. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Have a great spring break. If there's some of you I don't talk to over the weekend, if you don't have questions. But again, anyone that does have questions, let me know. I'll be looking for them. But have a great night. Have a great weekend. And I'll look for questions that you might have. But other than that, thank you so much for everything.
Professor?
Yes.
I wanted to say thank you very much. This has been a really interesting class.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. I'm so glad. So thank you again. It was a pleasure having you in class.
Okay. Working hard, trying to finish this up.
Absolutely, Sarah. And let me know if you have any questions that come up.
Absolutely. Bye-bye.
Have a good night. I'm going to stop the recording now.